Government can come along and with all the best intentions, cause enormous problems.
Hi, I'm Zach Weissmueller for Reason TV. I'm here with Gary Taubes, science writer and author of multiple books, including Good Calories, Bad Calories, The Diet Delusion, and most recently, Why We Get Fat and What to Do About It. Gary, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
You're a science writer, and a lot of what's gotten you attention is you're writing about nutrition. What first got you interested in the topic?
Well, I had done a couple of books on controversial science, what the good scientists would refer to as pathological science, which are this science of things that aren't so. After the second book, which was about this fiasco called cold fusion that took place in the late 1980s, some of my friends in the physics community said, well, if you think the science in cold fusion was bad, you should look at some of this stuff in public health. And everything I had learned about how to do good science in my 10 years previously as a science writer turned out you didn't actually have to do in observational epidemiology.
It's your belief that carbohydrate-intensive diets are actually harmful and that we should be eating animal fat, butter, salt, all that stuff.
In the 1960s, when the field of nutrition was kind of emerging fully blown as a subject of serious study in the US, it latched on to two ideas. One is that dietary fat is the cause of heart disease, and so we should eat low-fat diets, and if you can eat low-fat diets, replace the fat with carbohydrates. And the other is this idea that obesity is all about just energy balance, calories in versus calories out, and it makes it gluttony and sloth, in effect, using the biblical terms. These two ideas, dietary fat causes heart disease, obesity is just a disorder of eating too much and nothing else, became sort of the foundation of everything that happened since the 60s. As those hypotheses got tested, evidence never came around to support it, but one of the things that happened is as the nutrition public health sort of establishment grew from the 1960s onward, the existence of these hypotheses was considered reason enough to believe they were true.
You mentioned that the standards in epidemiology seem to be unusually loose. Why is this? Why is there so much pseudoscience in nutrition?
The first major obesity textbook to be written in the US in the 20th century was published in 1940 by a Hungarian emigre at Northwestern University. Out of about 500 references, some 200 plus were from the German language literature. And then the war comes, and the next obesity book written is in 1948. It's a clinical guide by two Mayo Clinic physicians. They have 500 some references, and 12 are from the German language literature. And so we just, not only did we put behind, sort of ignore everything that had been learned by these researchers about the potential cause of obesity, we lost the culture of science that allowed them to learn those things. So it's as though not only did we invent nutrition, metabolism, obesity research from scratch in the 1950s, the people doing it kind of invented what they thought was science in the 1950s.
When you make these claims, you obviously ruffle a lot of feathers in the scientific establishment. You've faced your fair number of critiques, some of them in Reason magazine. You went back and forth with a writer, and we'll link that in our video. One of the popular contentions, as you mentioned, is a calories in, calories out hypothesis. And it seems to make sense on the surface. Just consume less calories than you expend and you'll lose fat. Briefly describe why that's mistaken and how that notion came to be.
German diabetes specialists back in 1903, 1905 suggested that obesity was caused merely by taking in more calories than expended. It's like we're going to apply this new science of thermodynamics to this age-old or serious problem of obesity, and it was naive then. We're biological organisms, we're not physical organisms. If we wanted to ask the question why elephants have more fat on them than cheetahs, we would never apply thermodynamics to any of these issues. It's only in obesity that suddenly it becomes about energy rather about the hormonal regulation of the fat tissue.
The government and other, informational institutions are the subject of your critique also. Describe how knowledge kind of gets stuck almost.
In the 1950s, a University of Minnesota nutritionist named Ansel Keys comes up with this idea that dietary fat causes heart disease, particularly animal fats. And the American Heart Association gets behind it when there's effectively no experimental data whatsoever to confirm that it's true. The congressional committee run by George McGovern that had been founded in the late 1960s to deal with hunger in America decides they're going to get on board also. They put together a report called the Dietary Goals for the United States, and it just seems reasonable that one of the things they should tell us all to do is eat less fat and more carbohydrates. So they do. And then the USDA says, look at what this great thing that McGovern's committee is trying to do. So the USDA gets on board and it just steamrolls.
Once it gets rolling in one direction, there's not much of an incentive to...
Not much of an incentive to stop it because the studies never came around. But it's very hard for these government organizations, very hard for the health organizations like the American Heart Association to acknowledge making an error. So once you've started giving advice, how do you pull back and say we were wrong?
Yeah, how do you?
And I have no idea. I mean, I joke about the American Heart Association putting out a press release apologizing, saying, look, we're sorry that for the last 50 years we've been giving the wrong advice. And maybe we killed some of you or killed some of your relatives or, your loved ones, and that's, too bad. But now we got the advice right, and now you can trust us.
Part of it is they should be being held accountable by science writers, journalists.
Well, there's a lot of ways that the science and health writers don't live up to their obligations as journalists. One is, more than any other field, there seems to be this belief that what we should be doing is faithfully sort of translating the science and the medical pronouncements from the government and the researchers directly to the public. I had a Washington Post nutrition writer tell me that she thought her job was to faithfully represent what the USDA said about diet to the rest of the American public. And I was thinking, imagine any other reporter, even a sports reporter, who believed that his or her job was to faithfully represent what the coach of their local team was telling, rather than asking, is this good advice or not, and what evidence is there to support it.
What would you have to see to say, you know what, low-fat, high-carb advocates are right? What would convince you that hypothesis is the right one?
Now, that's an interesting question, because that hypothesis has been tested. And I'd argue it fails effectively every test. We spent roughly $500 million on the Women's Health Initiative. They took 49,000 women, randomized them so 20,000 got low saturated fat, relatively high carbohydrate diet, and the other 29,000 ate as usual. And that low fat, low carbohydrate diet had no benefits whatsoever. Ideally, what you would do is do the same kind of study and compare this low fat, high carbohydrate, modestly calorie restricted diet to the high fat, low carbohydrate diet, unrestricted in calories, and do it for 10 years in a lot of people. And if that low fat, low calorie, high carb diet did better, then that would be pretty conclusive evidence.
For reasons I don't quite understand, the low carb diet, whether it's Atkins or Paleo or Primal, has become somewhat popular within libertarian circles. Do you have any idea what that's about?
It could be as simple as several libertarians, influential libertarians, finding it works for them. I think libertarians probably like the idea that government agencies and federal agencies can just be dead wrong about issues.
Probably, yeah.
So, I find that I have fans in the economics community because I love the idea that there's a science out there that might be worse than macroeconomics. Actually, a lot of political economists seem to be fascinated by my work because of these implications that, A, there could be these simple ideas out there that have been lying there and have never been embraced and are right, and B, that, influential, the government can come along and with all the best intentions, cause enormous problems.